Good morning or afternoon. Thank you for joining FSMA Fridays. Hard to believe that 2017 is already here. We're delighted to continue FSMA Fridays into this new year, which should be prove to be a very interesting and activity-filled FSMA, all things FSMA. My name is Jill Bender, Safety Chain Software. Delighted to see the many people calling and logging into today's session. Today we are going to focus a little bit on common FSMA gaps and myths, so that should be some great conversation. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping reminders as always with FSMA Fridays. We do record the session. You will get a link sent out next week. We absolutely encourage questions, and we'll do our best to address questions that come in, so please go ahead and put them in the Q&A tab. For your privacy, you should only be able to see panelists today, although WebEx is being a bit buggy, so I'm glad so many people were able to log in. If you have trouble hearing via your computer speakers, please do use the call-in number provided. And as always with our agenda, we'll go ahead and do a quick FSMA update on what's going on, some pre-submitted questions and thoughts around FSMA gaps and myths, and we'll take your questions and answers and hopefully provide some great answers. With that, so delighted to have with us today our FSMA Fridays team. Thank you, Peyman with the Acheson Group for joining us, as well as Chris. Always a delight to have you on.
Great to be with you again.
Okay, great, thank you. And for those of you that are not logged into WebEx, I should probably do more of a formal introduction. I'm Dr. Peyman Fatemi with the Acheson Group as Vice President of Scientific Affairs. And Christopher Snabes is Senior Manager of Food Safety over at the Acheson Group. And I've noticed that your team just keeps growing, isn't it?
It has, Jill, and thankfully, because we certainly needed the help, and there's an awful lot of work and projects, and we're happy to have our newest member on board, and I'm sure we'll have them on the FSMA Friday at some point in the near future as well.
Yes, we'll get a group of panelists from the tag team on. That's great. So let's go ahead and get, you know us, we always try to keep things to succinct here, so let's go ahead and get started. Peyman, why don't you just share with us, what's the latest on the FSMA front?
Sure, yeah, a couple of things that I think stood out to me. One is the recent draft guidance on control of Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat foods that FDA put out, and it's a really good document, very in-depth document, 85 pages, and for those who are trying to control Listeria in their process environment, I highly recommend you to take a deep dive into understanding it. A lot of what's in there aligns nicely with the preventive controls rules for human foods and human-animal foods, but it does give some specific recommendations around what, or at least insight on what FDA looks for when it comes to controlling the Listeria in an environment, and which I thought was interesting. And even though you may not be doing exactly, because this is a guidance and not a rule, but it does give you an insight of what the FDA actually expects facilities to be doing, or at least be able to justify why they're doing what they're doing. And the guidance goes into some depth in terms of how to manage the personnel, the design of the facility, the equipment, the operations of it, the maintenance of it, sanitation, how to manage your raw materials, ingredients, process and formulation controls. So there's quite a bit of depth there. And they even mentioned, and I thought it was interesting, their recommendation to do Zone 1 testing for environmental monitoring, which, obviously not a lot of people are doing. And we're going to spend the next several newsletters at TAG talking about that. And I'm sure it's going to be a topic of discussion in future FSMA Fridays as well, is how do you manage this recommendation, and how are you in general managing your Zone 1 testing and food process contact surfaces testing and control. So highly recommended that audience and those that are interested go on site. Our site will have the link to the document, or it's on the FDA website as well, and take a deep dive and see how you align with what some of the recommendations are. And the other one, Jill, is the upcoming compliance date for sanitary transport rule. which is an interesting one. I think in general, what we're seeing is that folks are managing sanitation, sanitary transport of the product well, but the rule goes into some specifics in terms of the responsibilities and roles of various parties. Are you a shipper, a carrier, a loader, or a receiver? Or you may be a combination of both, or maybe all or none. So you need to know what the roles are. And as I think it's forcing folks to really look at the agreement, the contract, the legal contract between the various roles and parties within the rule, and determine who is responsible for what. That may end up changing how you manage and how you communicate, or even rewrite some of the contracts. And I think these are the things that folks are coming to grips with and understanding how to manage it. And it's coming up in April 7th, if I'm not mistaken, for larger companies, and 2018, same time 2018 for smaller companies. So those are a couple of the updates that are front and center, and things that we're kind of having a conversation with companies on.
Great, thank you for that. We'll probably end up doing a little bit more of a deeper dive into the sanitary transport rule, right, in the next month or two on FSMA Fridays. I noticed, with our audience at FSMA Fridays, each month, it varies the folks that join us based on our topic, but I do see quite a few folks that, based on their companies, that would absolutely be impacted directly as far as transportation carriers. So that'll be good.
Sure.
So let's go ahead and sort of dive in. What's interesting when we were talking with the Acheson Group about FSMA Fridays going into next year, and really trying to discern, different topics that is going to really provide information and value to our audience. And something that I thought was really interesting when we sort of just talked about, the tags role in consulting with companies and so forth, just sort of the commonalities of what you're finding with the companies you're working with as far as gaps within FSMA, as well as I thought myths. I think that's interesting. We've kind of put a play on words there just in respect of people still trying to figure out the impact and certain things around FSMA rules. So that is our topic for today. I'm excited about that. And Peyman, why don't you go ahead and just share with us just overall arching some of the gaps and myths around FSMA rules compliance.
Thank you, Jill. Yeah, great question. I think it's a really interesting approach, and I think a lot of companies have had a chance to take a look at the rule, take a look at their programs, and begin to put together, or may have already put together, the food safety plan that we'll talk about, and begin to compare where they are with respect to the rules. And so I think it's a timely question. It's a timely discussion, and ongoing discussions we'll have in the next several months is people are seeing where the gaps are, and there are some myths out there. And I have to say, some of the myths may be actually referring to some of the best in industry practices that may not just be written in the rules. So it's not a requirement per se of FSMA, but maybe something that you absolutely have to do. And we'll talk about that later today, and I'm sure in subsequent months. But I think in general, with FSMA and compliance to the various rules is, I think what we saw is a lot of companies have underestimated the complexity of developing a plan or improving and modifying the programs to become compliant. So they felt like, well, we are GFSI compliant, or various schemes that are recognized by GFSI. And so we should be already there. And you very well could be quite a ways in, but you're not 100% there. And I think folks kind of set it up thinking, oh, well, it's not a big deal. And they're realizing that it might be a bigger lift than they had anticipated. So that was one, is a gap that we've seen in general within TAG and talking to our clients. Other questions around which rules apply to me, although we're seeing this less and less. I think folks are identifying, or at least choosing a lane. Is it produce safety, or is it preventive controls? Whichever it is, they're beginning to identify. But from time to time, maybe smaller companies or those that may not be quite aware of some of the intricacies of the rules that are still, you're hearing those questions from time to time. Other gap that we've seen is around access to qualified people, especially in rural areas and properly trained personnel or those that have significant experience in the field. So companies are reaching out to consultants and other parties or having to put resources into hiring folks with the experience and proper experience to help them along the way. So those are some of the gaps we're seeing. And kind of in line with those underestimation of the complexity is the notion that I have plenty of time. And it was a myth, and it is that it's just not so, that you do really need to get started very early, because you will undoubtedly realize that there are areas that require more time and are more complex and need resources to change and modify to become FSMA compliant. So the time was absolutely a myth. A couple of interesting ones has to do around foreign facilities that import into U.S. It says, well, if I'm a foreign facility, the rules do not apply to me, which in fact, if you do, you will be subject to foreign supplier verification program. And essentially, if you're managing a risk or a hazard, then you will be subject to a lot of that. So talking with some of the companies and some of our colleagues abroad are helping us manage that. So it's one. And then the general notion that perhaps FDA inspectors knows more about food safety rules than I do. And our expectation is, and what we're seeing is that they're going through the same level of training and education as everybody else is in the industry. So it's not necessarily, some of them may have more experience, and that's great, but others are kind of trying to feel their way through it just like everybody else is. So it's not necessarily that they know a lot more and they're out there to get you. They're just trying to kind of understand where their knowledge gap is and trying to get themselves educated and up to speed. So there's some of the gaps and myths that we've seen so far with FSMA rules compliance.
And time always seems to be overarching, isn't it? The lack of time, certainly for this industry, right? And their day-to-day execution of programs and managing initiatives like this. No, thank you for that.
Yes.
You know, Chris, I'm going to go ahead and bring you in, and if you could share a little bit about some of the gaps and myths around food safety plans that we're seeing with FSMA.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. The food safety plan is the heart and soul of the preventive control rule. And some of the gaps that we have seen as we are talking to various companies and visiting their sites is the failure to consider all related hazards that are associated with their ingredients and their process. They have to take into consideration biological, chemical, and physical. And for the most part, they do a pretty good job identifying common and typical hazards that they'll deal with. But what we are seeing is there are some specifics that they are overlooking. And it could be bacteria that are inherently intrinsic to that ingredient. It could be that they are overlooking some of the new chemical requirements, that being radiological concerns. For the most part, radiological concerns impact your water source, be it water for production or ice for production or cleaning. Another chemical concern that a lot of facilities have not addressed are those that are economically motivated adulteration. A classic example would be the peanut shells that were mixed in with the cumin spice a while ago. That was an EMA, and it led to a food safety hazard, a peanut allergen hazard. So we see a lot of companies who do not do a fully in-depth hazard analysis. Once the hazard analysis is complete and really good, usually the rest of your food safety plan falls into place. Another gap that we see is a lot of the processes that are utilized in the facility have not been validated. For example, some of the preventive control devices, say it's a fryer, for instance. It might be validated to a known scientific paper. However, they only did it for one of their instruments and not for all of them that do the same process. And they may or may not be identical. So we are seeing that companies need to validate all of their kill steps. For example, if they have a kill step, to make sure each instrument that they're depending on is properly validated. Another gap that we see is lack of funding. There are some lack of management support and funding for some facilities, particularly if they're smaller in nature. And sometimes they fail to see the necessariness of implementing all the changes that have to be implemented to become in compliance with FSMA. That's a learning curve, and we see that with a lot of companies. And they realize that they have to invest in training, for example. They have to have or subcontract to a preventive controls qualified individual to either write the food safety plan or oversee the writing of the food safety plan. That's an expense that has to be taken by somebody. Another gap that we see is there can be a lack of understanding of science and the knowledge behind a hazard analysis, the FSMA rules in general, and we try to help these companies understand why a biological or microbiological risk can become a hazard, a safety hazard. A lot of facilities will have some people who may not have a higher education in these areas, and that can be okay as long as they, perhaps take additional education or training. But we're seeing some facilities have not even had general HACCP training. So there is some gap there. Another gap we see is an overall process narrative. When you're writing your food safety plan, there should be a narrative that says, hi, this is our company, this is what we make, this is how we make it. It's a general overall narrative at the beginning of the food safety plan, and a lot of facilities have not included that. Some of the myths that we see with the food safety plan are those facilities who claim, hi, I have a HACCP plan, therefore I do not need to do a food safety plan. HACCP is not HARP-C, it's not FSMA equivalent. It's a great start, and it covers many of the areas that FSMA requires, but it's not complete. HACCP doesn't address the phrases of preventive control, for example. So there's some educational gaps still there with that myth, thinking that HACCP is equivalent to HARP-C. Another myth we see is a company will say, hi, we have completed our food safety plan, and now my job is done. Well, they don't realize that it takes time and money to continually maintain and monitor the food safety plan. And if ever there's a change in the process or the building facility physical structure, they have to reanalyze their food safety plan. So just because you have it written, it doesn't mean it's done. It only means it's just the beginning. Another myth we see are companies who think that, hi, I have a GFSI recognized scheme, I got a great grade, a great score, therefore my certification is sufficient, I do not need to do a FSMA food safety plan. The GFSI plans and schemes are very close to what FSMA requires, but they are not equivalent. So there's some education there as well to help companies understand just because you're GFSI compliant does not mean your food safety plan is complete according to FSMA. So those are some of the food safety plan gaps and myths that we see.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. It's interesting in some of the things you brought up, the lack of funding or management support or, GFSI, things that we often talk about here at FSMA on Friday. So it doesn't come as big surprise, certainly, but it's interesting still that you all are consulting with clients about those specific things. Well, why don't we go ahead and then jump into a little bit of the gaps and myths you're seeing around sanitation. And again, I know we'll go into further depth in the following months, but go ahead and share with us some of the larger things you're seeing.
Hi, sure, yeah, I'd like to continue with that. So some of the gaps that we see with sanitation is we see that many times sanitation is driven by the production schedule, not necessarily on the risk microbial buildup. So for example, a lot of facilities will say, we always do a top to bottom gigantic cleanup, a deep down clean once a year, when they might have a very dusty process and it might need much more frequent sanitation cleaning. We've seen it in several facilities, and they have to realize just because you have a production schedule that says it does get cleaned, it might not be sufficient. So we ask facilities to take a closer look at that and say, hey, is there anything that we need to clean more frequently so we do not cause cross contact? Another gap we see is the failure to account for the age of equipment and the facility itself. A lot of facilities are old, and they're all over the country, they're all over the world, and continual maintenance of the structure of the facility, that's an ongoing challenge. Classic example is cracks in floors, holes in floors, drains that haven't been abandoned and need to be sealed up. So we see that gap as an ongoing challenge for many, many facilities. Same thing with the equipment. A lot of the equipment in some facilities are ancient. They might work fine, but they might not be designed to be cleaned and sanitized. And that can be a deep, deep issue, which I'm sure Peyman will talk about in a little bit in an upcoming slide. Some of the myths that we see is sanitation chemicals. A lot of facilities believe that their chemicals are effective. Yet, how do they know that it is effective? How are they monitoring it as they're using it? Do they make up a batch once a week and use it all week long and use it during the sanitation process without monitoring how effective the chemical is, what its concentration is, how diluted it is? So we see that as an issue with a lot of facilities. Another myth we see is regarding ATP swabbing. A lot of facilities will say, hi, I have swabbed my food contact surfaces, my numbers are low or very low, therefore I do not have a microbial issue. Well, that's not true. You might have a low count, but what if that low count is a food pathogen? So we see a lot of gaps in this regarding sanitation, and a lot of it is continual education to the facilities and their awareness of what they need to do to prevent any food safety issues.
Great, thanks, Chris. And it seems like with sanitation, that has been sort of a hot topic, certainly because of the rule that's about to date coming up, but just in general, it seems like a lot more questions, a lot more concerns around that, which seem very in line, obviously, with what you just shared. Well, I guess
yes.
Going hand in hand, right? No, thanks, Chris, for that. But certainly going hand in hand with that is, you know, as you were mentioning, thank you, a call out to Mike from our audience who was also saying, wait, what about environmental monitoring, right? I think, Peyman, if you want to go ahead and share with us, you know, the next steps as far as some gaps in this around the environmental monitoring programs.
Absolutely, Jill. Thank you. Yeah, and I think it does go hand in hand, and it does build on how well you're managing your process, you're controlling the process, your food safety plan, process control, you're sanitizing an environment, maintaining a sanitation, an effective and validated sanitation program, and how are you controlling the pathogen within your facility and monitoring it using an environmental monitoring program. I think the biggest gaps we see is that, and as Chris mentioned, is facilities just not taking a very serious look at where the organism could be hiding and taking that whole seek and destroy mentality that also FDA and the USDA are taking, in that they're not looking for areas that are difficult to clean, or some may be or may not be looking at all of them. It has to do some with the cleanability of the equipment, as Chris mentioned, and so if you do have facilities or equipment that are difficult to clean, is your environmental monitoring program trying to bring that out, trying to show the effectiveness of the sanitation program through swabbing and sampling those difficult to clean areas. So facilities are used to doing this certain way. They've been doing this for quite a long time, perhaps even. They've taken a lot of swabs. They invested a lot of resources and spent money on environmental monitoring, but they may not just be looking at all of the right places or all the difficult to clean areas that require this assembly for sanitation and subsequent verification of its effectiveness. And so and then if they are finding it, if they are finding positives, the corrective action is a bit of an issue. Many facilities may not do quite the right approach in terms of vector swabbing, looking at all the areas within the vicinity of that initial positive and trying to find the root cause and find out where that positive came from. And if they do find within that vector swabbing, taking further action, going further up the process until they have a better idea. They may not always find the actual smoking gun, so to speak, but at least getting a better idea of how that organism is tracking to the facility. So it's taking failure to take those proper actions, and I think those are the areas that FDA is also taking a very deep look at, and how are the facilities responding to these results and taking corrective actions. Are they redesigning equipment? Are they retraining their employees? Are they looking at the effectiveness of the chemicals, or maybe rotating chemicals to avoid microbial resistance buildup? And then, of course, the facilities have generated a ton of data here. They have months and years of total plate counts, coliforms, pathogens, ATP data, and it's all in perhaps an Excel file or various different files, but not necessarily analyzed to give them a better idea of a trend, a visualization of where that positive and how often it is. Is it driven by seasons? Is it driven by product? Is it driven by a particular process, or even a shift in terms of production schedules? So a lot of that data could be used to get a better understanding of how the organisms are tracking through your facility and how effective you are managing that. So we're working with some companies that are taking that very specific approach and providing a cloud-based data analysis to help facilities better understand that. So those are some of the gaps we're seeing. And of course, we talk to companies and they say, well, I haven't had a positive in 2 years. My process is safe. It very well could be, but if you haven't had a positive and you walk into a facility and you just see potential for issues, you see issues with personnel, traffic, management from the raw to the finished side, maybe weaknesses in the equipment design and the facility or control of the process, a lot of what Chris mentioned in the previous 2 slides, and you wonder why haven't they found it? And FDA will take a look at it from the same lens as well. So they may just not be looking at it in the right area. They may not be taking that whole seek and destroy mentality. And they may not be as safe as they think they are. And of course, the other one that has been a topic of discussion, both FSMA Fridays with others and have been an issue with a lot of companies, is I have to perform whole genome sequencing. Well, that's what FDA is doing. If you're finding and repeatedly finding an organism after you have tried to take corrective action, that may be an approach you want to take, but it's not something you have to do. It may be something you may want to consider. Of course, you have to take a lot more into consideration in terms of your exposure, potential expansion of a recall, because if you find organism that links with something you found 2 years ago, then you have your entire 2 years worth of production under question. So the question is, how well are you managing your results? How well are you managing and taking corrective actions, doing root cause analysis to avoid having to go down the path of whole genome sequencing? But certainly, if you're on the radar of the FDA, or if they come in and if it's a for cause, or whether it's been an illness or a positive in the facility, they will certainly take, or in a product, they will certainly take swabs and perform that swabathon that everybody kind of refers to find out, and then we'll do whole genome sequencing on their side. So the question is, how well are you lined up to do that as well? And it's a tough one to answer. It's not a requirement, but again, maybe one of those practices that if you're having a difficulty managing, may want to consider, or at least come up with alternative ways to manage the environmental monitoring and control of the organism within your facility. So those are some of the myths. I'm sure it's going to generate a lot of questions, and be happy to open it up for that, Joe.
Okay, great, thank you. You know, I think it's interesting and a lot of the general themes across here when you were talking about the sort of the insufficient data analysis, and I know that's certainly one of the many reasons customers come to us as far as safety chain goes, because it's really the idea that there's data everywhere, and often in the industry we hear data rich and information poor, right? So lots of data out there, and how are you using it, and how easy are you able to use it to identify those trends? Seems really important, even more so obviously with sanitation and environmental monitoring now. Well, let's go ahead
of course.
And let me go ahead and take us out of full screen here, and this will open up as far as people having questions. Again, if you are logged in, please go ahead and submit some questions. I see a few that have already come in, and we'll try our best to address a few. Then also just a few things, because we are at the bottom of the hour, and I know lots of folks allocate just a half hour to our monthly session. So for those that do have to leave, thank you for joining us. If you can stay on for 10 more minutes, we'll go ahead and dive into some questions that have come in for both Chris and Peyman. Thank you. And I also do have a few chats that have said that's some really good high-level information. You know, can I get that? So we will absolutely send out the recording, and then we always do a recap, sort of a broader post that just happened on our blog. So we'll go ahead and put an outline of some of the things that were discussed today and send that link out as well as a high-level overview. A couple quick things. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, of course, the Acheson Group obviously has in-depth experience in helping customers getting ready and prepared for FSMA, and broader scope beyond that as far as our services go. So I encourage you to visit their website, sign up for their newsletter every time it comes out. Us at Safety Chain, we always learn something new and bring that into our customers and prospects alike. So I do encourage you to visit their site. Guidance documents are always on it. And then certainly as a host of FSMA Fridays and a partner in this industry, you know, and Peyman mentioned, you know, having a centralized database and cloud-based solution, that's what Safety Chain does. And we do help ensure FSMA compliance, whether it's managing your suppliers via partner portals or ensuring program tasks are completed, or identifying issues earlier to make sure they don't become larger problems, but really talk more about the proactively trending your data for continuous improvement and having access to those records. So when the FDA comes knocking on the door, you're not scrambling as much, right? So a few questions that have come in. Let's go ahead and take those, and thank you again for everyone's participation here. One question that did come in just in regards to HACCP plan. Let me go ahead and find that question. I saw Sarah had submitted that earlier. Says we are currently developing our food safety plan and already have a HACCP plan. Could we just use our food safety plan instead of our HACCP plan? And gentlemen, I'll let one of you decide which one wants to answer that.
Chris, go ahead and tackle it, and I'll join in with you.
Okay. Sure. Thank you. Depending on what your suppliers are asking and or what kind of certifications you have, you can have a food safety plan instead of a HACCP plan. Some certifications require a HACCP plan that is separate from a food safety plan. Obviously, a food safety plan can be more in-depth and have obviously much more record keeping associated with it. If you are not required to have a HACCP plan and you have no suppliers or accreditations or certifications that request a HACCP plan, you absolutely can have just a food safety plan. A food safety plan will satisfy the requirements of FSMA.
Okay, great.
I agree with you.
Anything
and you know, the other part would be some of the exemptions from the FSMA would be low acid canned foods, seafood HACCP, and juice HACCP that do have their own specific requirements around HACCP that you know, the food safety plan may not necessarily address. So, but I agree with you, Chris. I think you can have a food safety plan to address a lot of the specifics of FSMA.
Okay, great, thank you. A couple other questions. One that we didn't really talk about today, but I know it's been a topic in the past previously. Excuse me, Ed is asking, with regards to importing, what requirements, again, this could be a very long discussion, so let's probably perhaps keep it a high level, but with regards to importing, what requirements do food brokers have to comply? I think the key thing in here, what's interesting in this question is, considering they do not really see the product, just handle paperwork, right? We hear that a lot in this sort of question.
I think they also have to, in terms of foreign supplier verification, you know, those, either the company that works with the food broker, let's say you're going to buy from them, these are some of the requirements that you're going to ask the broker to ensure their suppliers are complying with. In most cases, you want some level of visibility to who those brokers are working with to help you better understand how they're managing, if there's especially a risk that they're specifically managing, if there's a hazard that they're controlling. And so I think those guys play a significant role in ensuring that their supplier, their foreign suppliers, or domestic for that matter, do understand and are addressing the risk. So they do play a significant role here into being visible or working closely with their customers and their suppliers to ensuring the risks are being managed. So, Chris, anything you want to add there?
The only thing I would add, Peyman, is that if they are the importer of record, then they have the key responsibilities, their job first.
Yeah, that's true.
That's as far as that goes. Yeah, that's fine. This topic does come up every FSMA Fridays, right? So thank you for that part as well. It's interesting. Everyone wants to know who's really in charge, and you know, it seems like it's a partnership throughout the supply chain, right?
It really is.
Right. Okay, great. No, thank you. Let me go ahead and see if we can maybe address one more question. We are running a little bit out of time here, so let me go ahead and see. This one's an interesting one, and we talked about this as 2016 was coming to a close when Dr. Acheson was on the call last month, just in regards to a new administration coming in. You know, a little bit of a crystal ball, but again, if there's anything that we think might, you know, the tag team thinks that might be impacted FSMA-wise by the new administration. So who wants to put their crystal ball on and help us out on this?
Well, I think in general, I think we can expect FSMA it's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. It's regardless of the administration, and you know, it's something that is mandated by the Congress. Now, the administration could impact the funding that's appropriated to the FDA to implement this. So that may be, but the extent of that, it remains to be seen. But I think the rules and the compliance and all of that is in place, and it's not going to change. It just might be. And we'll have to see how the resources and the funding is impacted. That would be my take on it.
Anything else to add on that, Chris?
No, I agree with what Peyman said.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that the new administration has quite a few other things that they're chasing after as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for that information. So what I'll go ahead and do is, again, we do try to keep these sessions succinct, but there's so much information shared here. Thank you, gentlemen, both, for providing a little bit more information on what you're seeing out there as far as gaps and myths, and we'll kind of continue that theme into next month. I'm also very excited to announce with FSMA Fridays too, we are going to be extending FSMA Fridays a little bit offline. We're in the midst of developing a private LinkedIn group just for FSMA Fridays participants. So be on the lookout for that invitation later this next month in February. So we're very excited about that, where we can continue the dialogue online when it's not just FSMA Friday sessions. And then certainly as far as resources go, please, we will send out a blog post, but Safety Chain always recaps these sessions, as well as recording link that you will receive in your inbox. We have a few upcoming webinars that may be of interest. Next Tuesday, we're just doing a high-level overview of Safety Chain's tools for success, your food safety and quality operations. If you're interested in learning more about how Safety Chain helps operations become more effective in ensuring compliance. And then certainly, as I mentioned, TAG's site is just a plethora of resources. I encourage you to visit those. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up today's session. If we did not get to your question, we have it down. We'll perhaps address it next month or post it in the new LinkedIn group that will be launched. And we really appreciate everyone's participation. And again, thank you, both Peyman and Chris, for an insightful, informative discussion today.
Great to be with you again, Jill.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Okay. Thank you all, and have a good day.